Pacific Theater, late 1944. The sky above the South China Sea trembles with sunlight. Below, the ocean glints like 1,000 mirrors. A formation of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, once the undisputed predators of the Pacific, cuts through the clouds, their engines droning in perfect rhythm. In the lead cockpit, Lieutenant Saburo, a seasoned ace, scans the horizon. He spots distant silver dots, small at first, growing unnervingly fast. His instinct says American fighters, but not like any he's seen before. They're closing far too quickly. Moments later, the glints sharpen into sleek metallic aircraft, their noses long, their wings razor straight. They don't climb like wildcats. They don't turn like corsairs. They soar and dive with impossible grace, engines howling with a deeper foreign resonance. Saburo banks left. The new enemy follows effortlessly, matching every move. Within seconds, gunfire rips through his tail section. Flames erupt. The ace who once mocked American design now watches his cockpit engulf in fire as the silver machines vanish into the clouds. Above him, a voice crackles through Allied radios, calm, confident. Mustangs returning to base. Targets neutralized. The reign of the Zero has just met its reckoning. Japan's early aerial supremacy and the birth of the Zero when war ignited across the Pacific in 1941. Japan's air arm stood unrivaled. The Imperial Japanese Navy, long underestimated by Western strategists, had engineered a masterpiece of aerial warfare. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero. Lightweight, agile and revolutionary in range, the Zero stunned the world from the first day of Pearl Harbor. Its 160-horsepower Nakajima Sakai engine gave it unmatched maneuverability, allowing it to outturn, outclimb, and outrun nearly every Allied aircraft it encountered. The Western powers, burdened by heavier, less efficient designs, were unprepared for such precision. From the Philippines to Burma, from Wake Island to the Coral Sea, the Zero dominated. Its pilots, many veterans from the Sino-Japanese conflict, wielded both superior machines and superior doctrine. Lightning fast, disciplined, and fearless. American pilots called it invincible. The British labeled it supernatural. For Japan, the Zero was more than a weapon. It was national pride forged in aluminum. Engineers at Mitsubishi had defied convention. Thinner skin for lighter weight, extreme range through integral fuel tanks, and a devotion to simplicity and responsiveness. It was the aerial embodiment of Bushido, elegance masking lethality. But pride has a pattern. It blinds before it breaks. By mid-1942, the tide began to shift. The Battle of Midway cost Japan 4 fleet carriers and, critically, its most experienced pilots. America, once caught in shock, began learning fast. Test flights of captured Zeros in the Aleutians revealed their weaknesses: fragile frames, lack of armor, and limited diving capability. The Zero's glory depended on the one thing America could destroy: Japan's ability to replace its aces. While Japanese engineers refined existing designs, American industry did something different. It reinvented the concept of the fighter itself. The early U.S. warplanes, the P-40 Warhawk, the F-4F Wildcat, the P-39 Airacobra, had fought bravely, but without parity. Against the Zero, they relied on luck and altitude. But deep within North American aviation's facilities in California, a new project was taking shape. It began not as a legend, but as a contract born of British desperation. In 1940, the British Air Purchasing Commission had approached American manufacturers seeking fighters for the Royal Air Force. North Americans' response was bold. Instead of merely improving the P-40, they proposed a completely new design, built from scratch, ready in just 120 days. The result would be the NA-73X prototype. the aircraft destined to become the P-51 Mustang. Initially, the Mustang was average at best. Its Allison engine limited it to low altitudes, and British pilots dismissed it as fast but unremarkable. The Japanese would never have feared such a plane, but a hidden potential lay within its aerodynamics, a laminar flow wing design that minimized drag, allowing for unprecedented efficiency and range. All it lacked was the right heart, the right engine. That heart would come from Britain itself. By 1942, the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine transformed the Mustang from an underdog into a monster. With the Merlin's two-stage supercharger, the aircraft could climb higher, fly faster, and sustain combat beyond 30,000 feet, far above the Zero's effective ceiling. Suddenly, Japan's once superior creation faced extinction. American engineers had learned what Japanese mechanics refused to believe. Aerodynamics could surpass agility, endurance could defeat maneuverability, and industrial scalability could outlast craftsmanship. The Pacific was no longer an arena of grace and dogfighting poetry. It was becoming a test of endurance, speed, and reach. The Zero's days of circling its prey were numbered. The hunters were evolving, and the Mustang was their vanguard. The seeds of reversal had been planted. The Pacific skies that once belonged entirely to Japan were about to be invaded not by bombers, but by machines that could fly higher, faster, and farther than any warrior nation had prepared for. The Americans called it innovation. The Japanese called it impossible. But the impossible was now airborne. The Mustang's evolution. From prototype to Pacific Predator Inglewood, California, 1942. Inside North American Aviation's assembly halls, the air hummed with a new rhythm. Blueprints littered drafting tables. Technicians moved with quiet urgency. Every rivet, every curve of the Mustang's fuselage carried the pressure of a war whose outcome would depend on industrial precision as much as bravery. The Mustang's transformation was not accidental. It was deliberate engineering evolution. When British test pilots first flew the modified version powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the results were shocking. The aircraft that once struggled above 15,000 feet now soared past 30,000 with ease. Its speed jumped beyond 430 miles per hour. Its climb rate doubled. North American engineers reworked its cooling system using the Meredith effect, converting the heat from the radiator into additional thrust. The Mustang was now faster because it stayed cooler. The laminar flow wing reduced drag so effectively that fuel efficiency became an advantage. Combined with external tanks, it could escort bombers from Britain to Berlin and back, a feat no fighter had ever achieved. Across the Pacific, reports of this new aircraft reached Japanese intelligence. Initially, engineers dismissed them. The Zero's design philosophy, lightness, tight turning, total pilot harmony, was seen as the ultimate expression of aerial combat. They called Western designs clumsy, overweight, soulless. But the Americans had shifted the terms of warfare. The Mustang wasn't built for turn-based duels. It was built for reach, endurance, and raw power. Its pilot no longer fought with instinct alone, but with machine advantage. Where the Zero needed grace, the Mustang needed numbers, horsepower, altitude, range. By 1943, the Mustang dominated European skies. It escorted B-17 and B-24 bombers deep into enemy territory, tearing apart the Luftwaffe's last defenses. Pilots like George Preddy and Chuck Yeager became symbols of a new aerial doctrine: kill before being seen. The war in Europe was proving the Mustang's supremacy, but the Pacific awaited its own reckoning. In Japan, the Zero still ruled. Over the Marianas, Formosa, and the Philippines, Japanese pilots clung to tactics that had once brought glory: high-speed dives, tight rolls, climbing spirals. But those maneuvers relied on an outdated truth. that no enemy could sustain pursuit at high altitude and high speed. By late 1944, the truth collapsed. When the U.S. introduced the P-51D Mustang to the Pacific Theater, the dynamic changed overnight. The D model, equipped with 650 caliber Browning machine guns and self-sealing fuel tanks, carried the endurance to escort B-29 bombers on 12-hour missions. The same long-range endurance that once defined the Zero now belonged to its nemesis. Japanese mechanics and pilots began to realize the difference was not in skill, but in time. America's war machine produced perfection through iteration, each model more refined, more resilient. Japan's industrial base, bombed and stretched thin, could not adapt. The Zero remained elegant but static. Its creators, bound by tradition and resource scarcity, refined the past while America built the future. The arrival of the Mustang was not just technological, it was symbolic. It announced the arrival of the industrial age in the skies of the Pacific. No longer would air combat be a duel of equals. It would be a contest of endurance and engineering. The first Japanese encounters with the Mustang brought disbelief. Pilots reported being outrun, outclimbed, and outgunned. Their radio intercepts described a new type of American plane that does not turn. It ascends. What Japan once mocked as Western, excess now outperformed its most sacred. Creation. The engineers who once measured strength in agility now faced a new language of power. Superchargers, drag coefficients, fuel ratios, horsepower curves. These were not romantic words, but they defined the new war. The balance of the Pacific had shifted, not through courage or numbers, but through design, and soon that design would confront its rival head-on in the skies above the Philippines, where pride would meet precision, and the legend of the Zero would begin to burn out under the shadow of the Mustang. 1. Tactical angle, speed, and the death of the dogfight. By 1944, the Pacific sky had become a laboratory of evolving tactics. What once began as graceful aerial duels between evenly matched machines had transformed into something mechanical, mathematical, and merciless. The Mitsubishi A6M0, once the master of the turning fight, was now obsolete the moment the Mustang entered its airspace. Its core advantage, low weight and extreme agility, became its downfall. The same thin frame that once allowed it to dance through clouds now shattered under high-speed dives. The same minimal armor that once saved weight now doomed its pilots to death with the first burst of .50 caliber fire. In contrast, the P-51 Mustang didn't need to turn tighter. It simply refused to fight on the Zero's terms. Its pilots climbed higher, attacked from above, and disengaged at will. A new kind of combat philosophy called boom and zoom. The Mustang dictated the engagement. The Zero could only react. The Mustang's Merlin engine gave it a top speed exceeding 430 km/h, nearly 70 mph faster than the Zero. In vertical combat, it was untouchable. Its diving speed approached 500 mph before control stiffening. A Zero attempting to follow would lose wings long before reaching that velocity. Japanese pilots, trained in pre-war tactics emphasizing close-range maneuver and instinct, found themselves trapped in a deadly paradox. To fight meant to slow down. To slow down meant to die. At high altitude, the Mustang reigned supreme. Its supercharged engine delivered consistent power, where the Zero's sake engine gasped for oxygen. Above 25,000 feet, Japanese pilots entered combat already disadvantaged. Below, the Mustang's energy retention and superior roll rate erased what little edge the Zero retained. The Mustang's 6 Browning M2 machine guns fired with destructive precision. Each wing carried nearly 400 rounds per gun. A single 2-second burst could shred a Zero from wingtip to tail. The Japanese pilots soon learned that even a glancing hit could ignite the aircraft's fuel tanks. the price of a design optimized for agility over survivability. This was no longer a contest of bravery. It was a contest of physics. The Mustang turned the air war into a technical equation. Whoever owned altitude, energy, and speed won. The Zero's glory faded in the glare of this new arithmetic. Human angle, pride, disbelief, and the shock of collapse for Japanese pilots? Defeat came not through cowardice, but through cognitive dissonance. For years, they had been told their aircraft represented perfection. Every enemy plane destroyed in the early war years reinforced that myth. The Zero was more than a fighter. It was an identity, the embodiment of national genius. When the Mustang appeared, that myth cracked. Pilots returning from missions began reporting impossible accounts. The American plane climbs away even when damaged. It turns faster than our Zero at high speed. We cannot catch it even in a dive. Mechanics dismissed these as exaggerations, excuses for failure. But failure kept multiplying. Japanese squadron leaders found morale disintegrating. The code of Bushido demanded death before defeat. Yet pilots were dying without even seeing the enemy who killed them. Mustang attacks came from above, from the sun, from ranges beyond the Zero's visibility. The humiliation was not personal. It was systemic. American pilots, many in their early 20s, faced a different reality. They respected the Zero, but they no longer feared it. They knew its limitations by study, not rumor. Training manuals explicitly taught how to exploit the Zero's fragility. Do not turn with him. Dive away. Use your power. The Mustang gave even average pilots the tools to become aces. For the Japanese, each engagement felt like running against gravity itself. Their once superior aircraft could no longer dictate the pace or shape of battle. Every dogfight began with hope and ended in physics. The loss of control, both literal and psychological, broke something deeper than tactics. It shattered faith in craftsmanship. Japan had built the Zero as an extension of its warrior soul. Hand-assembled, aerodynamically perfect, spiritually pure. The Mustang was born of industry, standardized parts, and assembly line pragmatism, and yet it was the machine of mass production that proved superior to the machine of devotion. By the end of 1944, young Japanese pilots were being trained in a fraction of the time once required. Experience had vanished with their predecessors. In contrast, America's pilot training system, fueled by data and feedback, produced efficient killers faster than Japan could bury its losses. The Mustang became more than an aircraft. It was a psychological weapon. To the Americans, it symbolized inevitability. To the Japanese, it symbolized the end of mastery. The skies that had once echoed with the cry of the Zero now carried a new sound, a deep, throaty howl of the Merlin engine. To those who heard it from below, it was not just the sound of an approaching enemy. It was the sound of technological truth, and in that truth, the legend of invincibility began to die. The story of the Mustang versus the Zero was not just a contest between machines. It was a collision of ideologies. Japan's design philosophy was artisanal. Every Zero was built as though it were a sword. Light, elegant, and lethal only in the hands of a master. Every gram mattered. Engineers removed armor plating, pilot protection, and even self-sealing fuel tanks to preserve agility. The Zero's strength was its purity, unburdened by excess, defined by motion. America's design philosophy was industrial. The Mustang was not built to reflect beauty, but to achieve dominance. It didn't rely on a craftsman's intuition. It relied on mathematics, wind tunnels, and scalability. Its laminar flow wing wasn't sculpted for elegance, but for function. A new aerodynamic breakthrough that delayed drag and extended range. Japan sought balance between man and machine. America sought supremacy through engineering. The Zero was hand-fitted. The Mustang was machine-perfect. The Zero emphasized instinctive control. The Mustang emphasized mechanical consistency. One demanded skill, the other multiplied it. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, later licensed to Packard in the United States, became the defining factor. Its two-stage supercharger allowed the Mustang to maintain performance at altitudes the Zero could barely reach. At 30,000 feet, the Mustang could still climb aggressively. The Zero's power curve fell off like a cliff beyond 20,000. Cooling, another overlooked frontier, was where the Mustang's genius became invisible. The Meredith effect radiator turned drag into thrust, a small aerodynamic miracle that gave the plane free power simply from the airflow it generated. The Zero, by contrast, still relied on traditional engine cooling methods, efficient for short dogfights, disastrous for sustained high-speed pursuit. Even materials reflected the difference in industrial capacity. Japan's aluminum was increasingly impure due to wartime shortages, resulting in weaker airframes. America's aircraft factories, fueled by near-unlimited supply lines, could produce hundreds of Mustangs a week, each identical, each reliable. The contrast was not moral. It was mechanical. Japan had built a masterpiece of 1930s engineering and refused to abandon it. America built a prototype of 1950s warfare and kept improving it. When the Mustang appeared, the Zero had already reached its evolutionary ceiling. Japan's attempts to modernize, the A6M5, the A7M Repu, were too little, too late. Strangled by material shortages and the collapse of industrial infrastructure, the Mustang, in essence, was the future that Japan's engineers could no longer afford to imagine. Before the Mustang, the Pacific Air War was fragmented by distance. Islands dictated strategy. Aircraft carriers were lifelines. Japan's Zero thrived because it could fly farther than any Allied fighter, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. Then came the Mustang, and distance stopped being Japan's ally. With external tanks, the P-51D could cover over 1,600 miles, a range that turned the Pacific into a single continuous battlefield. It could take off from Iwo Jima, escort B-29 bombers all the way to Tokyo, and return without refueling. This was not an advantage. It was annihilation of strategic geography. The Zero's greatest weapon, its range, was no longer unique. And the one domain it still held, carrier warfare, was fading under the shadow of the B-29's long-range bombing campaign. The Mustang's endurance also meant persistence. It could remain in enemy airspace for hours, circling high above, waiting. The Zero, with its smaller fuel capacity and less efficient engine, could not. Japanese pilots entered combat with the ticking clock of fuel running against them. Once their tanks neared empty, the Mustang pilots simply climbed, conserved, and returned later. By 1945, Japan's skies were no longer defensive. They were exposed. Mustang escorts enabled the B-29 superfortresses to strike at the Japanese homeland with impunity. The few remaining Zeros scrambled from airfields on Kyushu and Honshu were often intercepted before reaching altitude. The outcome was predictable, yet devastating. Japanese pilots no longer sought victory. They sought honor. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, now flew missions knowing it would not return. The Mustang's role expanded from escort to executioner. It hunted stragglers, strafed airfields, and obliterated supply convoys. Its 6 guns cut through hangars, fuel dumps, and transport columns alike. Every mission deepened Japan's aerial starvation. Strategically, the Mustang was the perfect weapon for an industrial war. Versatile, maintainable, mass-producible. It could serve in Europe 1 month, the Pacific the next. It didn't need glory to justify itself. Its numbers did that. Japan's strategic response, the kamikaze, was the clearest sign of despair. When machinery could no longer compete, flesh was sacrificed in its place. It was not courage that drove such missions, but absence of options. In this shift, the meaning of air power changed forever. No longer about duels or dominance through skill, it became about control, of altitude, of industry, of resources, of time. The Mustang's shadow stretched across every front. The same aircraft that had shattered the Luftwaffe's back now circled the Pacific's skies, reducing what remained of Japan's empire to smoke and wreckage. By the spring of 1945, the once proud Zero had become a relic still airborne, and beneath it, Japanese mechanics, the same men who once mocked the Mustang's bulky frame, stood in silence as Allied formations streaked overhead. Faster than sound could carry their disbelief. The war of design was over. The war of endurance had been won. And the decisive moment, the final humiliation of the Zero, was about to unfold in full daylight over the Philippines, where speed, technology, and history would converge in one final confrontation. October 1944, the Philippines. The largest naval engagement in human history was unfolding across the Leyte Gulf, but above the ocean, a different kind of battle decided who would own the air. American bombers, B-24 Liberators and B-25 Mitchells, roared toward Japanese positions, escorted by a new presence, the P-51 Mustang. Sleek, untested in the Pacific until now, it climbed higher than any Allied fighter before it. Below, Japanese radar operators reported incoming aircraft. They expected the usual, slow, predictable formations. What they saw instead were signatures moving at speeds beyond anything their interceptors could match. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force scrambled. Zeros from Clark Field and Nichols Field. Dozens of A6M5s took off, their engines straining, their pilots repeating the same ritual words. For the Emperor, for honor. Among them were veterans who had fought since the days of Pearl Harbor, survivors of Coral Sea, Midway, and Rabaul. They knew the odds, but not the enemy. Many still believed American planes were inferior, that Japanese skill could overcome machinery. At 25,000 feet, the formations met. The first Mustang attack was silent until the guns opened. High above the sun's glare, the P-51s dove at over 450 miles per hour, faster than the Zeros could roll or turn. The 650 caliber guns of each Mustang tore through the formations in seconds. For the Japanese pilots, the shock was instantaneous. Their training had never prepared them for this speed differential. Attempts to evade only worsened the outcome. Steep climbs caused engine stalls. Dives caused airframe failure. Pilots tried the one move that had once ensured survival, a sharp turn at low altitude. The Mustang didn't follow. It climbed, looped, and struck again from above. This was not combat. It was extermination. One Zero after another spiraled downward, engines smoking, wings shearing apart. American pilots later described the engagements as targets falling out of formation before they knew we were there. Captain Charles Weaver, flying escort that day, recorded 12 victories in 3 missions. His gun camera film showed Zeros disintegrating midair before their pilots could even break formation. What the Japanese called honor now looked like futility through the lens of the Mustang's gun sight. Radio transmissions from Japanese airfields turned panicked. "They dive like stones but climb like eagles," one pilot reported. "Their guns reach before we can even aim." Another transmission ended abruptly in static. On the ground, Japanese mechanics stood helpless as the few surviving aircraft limped home, riddled with bullet holes. Some returned without landing gear, some with canopies shattered, some trailing fuel and oil like blood. The pilots stepped out pale, silent, eyes wide with disbelief. One mechanic, a veteran from Mitsubishi's Nagoya plant, was overheard whispering, "This is not a plane. It is a storm." The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The Mustang, born of industrial mass and technical calculation, had destroyed the myth of the handcrafted warrior machine. American pilots, too, felt the difference. They no longer entered the sky hoping for parity. They owned it. They flew faster, fought longer, and returned home with fuel still in their tanks. "You could feel it," one recalled. "We had taken the sky away from them. Completely." By late October, Mustang formations began striking airfields directly. Their 50 caliber guns shredded parked aircraft and fuel depots. The air over Luzon was filled with smoke and broken wings. Japan's attempt to contest the sky had collapsed. For Japanese commanders, the realization was strategic as much as emotional. They could no longer protect their supply lines. Without air cover, convoys to the Philippines were annihilated. The Imperial Navy, already crippled at Leyte Gulf, now had no shield from above. The Mustang had not just won dogfights, it had erased the Japanese concept of air control. From Tokyo, reports flowed back to the design offices that had once mocked the P-51 as a brute. Engineers who had championed lightness and elegance studied photographs of wrecked Zeros and asked questions they could no longer answer. Why did the enemy's heavier plane fly faster? Why did its cooling system produce thrust? Why did it still maneuver at altitude when ours fell apart? Each question was a wound. Each photograph, an obituary for an era of craftsmanship that could not survive industrial war. The Mustang had turned air combat into engineering truth, and while the skies over the Philippines burned with the final cries of the Zero, an even greater test awaited: the full-scale annihilation of Japan's homeland air defense, where the Mustang would no longer face exhausted pilots, but desperation itself. By early 1945, the Pacific War had entered its terminal phase. Japan still held the illusion of defense, but its air power existed mostly on paper. The few remaining Zero squadrons, worn, underfueled, and manned by half-trained cadets, faced the most advanced air machine of the war. The P-51 Mustang now operated from Iwo Jima, newly captured in blood and ash. The island's runways were the final piece of a plan that placed Tokyo itself within range. From there, the 8th Air Force launched waves of B-29, superfortresses bound for the Japanese mainland, and the Mustangs went with them. This was the endgame the Zero had never been designed to fight. At dawn on April 7, 1945, hundreds of Mustangs lifted from Iwo Jima's volcanic dust, each carrying full fuel tanks and 6 loaded guns. The B-29s lumbered behind them, black silhouettes against the rising sun. Ahead lay Japan, the land that had birthed the Zero, now the stage of its extinction. Japanese radar stations detected the incoming waves, but could do little more than sound alarms. Airfields at Chofu, Atsugi, and Kanoya scrambled what few fighters remained. The once proud A-6M Zero now took off from cratered runways, engines coughing black smoke, fuel reserves rationed to a few gallons per sortie. When contact came over the coast of Honshu, it was merciless. The Mustangs struck in organized sweeps, diving from high altitude, attacking airfields, rail lines, convoys, anything that moved. The Zeros rose to meet them. But what followed was not a battle. It was mechanical inevitability. The Zero, at its best, could reach 350 mph in level flight. The Mustang, cruising easily at 440, dictated every second of the fight. The Japanese pilots tried to climb into the attack, but their engines overheated and lost compression. They tried to dive away, but their airframes disintegrated under the strain. The American fighters simply rolled over, accelerated, and re-engaged. For the first time in the war, Japanese ground observers reported Mustangs circling above Tokyo, unopposed. They flew figure eights at 30,000 feet, unhurried, as if asserting ownership of the sky. Down below, in the factories where the Zero had been born, workers stopped what they were doing to watch them. The sound was different from anything they'd heard. A deep, resonant growl that didn't fade. It wasn't just power, it was permanence. At Atsugi Airfield, a handful of Zeros attempted to intercept a returning Mustang escort. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. The Mustangs approached from the sun, fired controlled bursts, and climbed away untouched. Of the 8 Zeros that took off, 6 were destroyed. The remaining 2 crash-landed near the shoreline. One pilot survived. He was 21 years old and had less than 30 flight hours. The psychological collapse was complete. What began as disbelief turned into resignation. Japan's air doctrine, once built on the supremacy of the individual ace, was irrelevant in a world ruled by performance data, manufacturing output, and systematized war. American pilots, now flying missions daily over Japan, remarked on the eerie silence of the opposition. "We saw them sometimes on the ground," one said, "but rarely in the air. They'd run out of everything: planes, fuel, pilots, hope." Mustang pilots strafed rail lines, destroyed power stations, and set cities ablaze in coordinated strikes. The same aircraft that had escorted bombers to Berlin was now reducing Japan's heartland to ruin. The Merlin engine, designed in Britain, built in America, now sang over Tokyo, a requiem for the machine that once ruled Asia's skies. Inside Mitsubishi's design offices, engineers sat among blueprints they no longer had materials to build. The A7M Repu, intended successor to the Zero, existed only as an incomplete prototype. Fuel shortages and bombing raids had crippled production. The engineers who once mocked the Mustang's inelegant radiator now studied its design in photographs, admitting what pride had long denied. It was not crude. It was genius. A captured Zero, brought to the U.S. for testing in 1942, had already revealed its secrets. But now, the war itself exposed its fatal flaw: perfection that could not evolve. The Mustang, built to be improved, refined, and mass-produced, kept advancing until there was nothing left to oppose it. By the summer of 1945, Japan's skies belonged entirely to the Americans. Mustangs flew over every major city without challenge. Their pilots, sometimes barely out of training themselves, looked down on a defeated empire and saw no enemy aircraft. The once mighty Zero, symbol of Japan's early war dominance, had vanished into history's exhaust trail. The last recorded Mustang Zero encounter occurred in July 1945 near the outskirts of Tokyo Bay. A lone Japanese pilot, flying an aging A6M5, attempted to intercept a B-29 formation. 2 Mustangs dove to meet him. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. The Zero was shot down before it could fire a single round. Witnesses on the ground reported the burning wreckage spiraling into the sea. The Mustang pilots never saw the pilot's face, only the smoke column rising against the morning light. That was how the legend ended. Not in glory, but in silence. The same silence that filled the skies weeks later. When Japan surrendered, the Zero had once symbolized perfection. The Mustang proved perfection meant nothing against progress. The end of the Zero, and the triumph of engineering evolution. When Japan's formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 6, 1945, the war in the Pacific was finally over. The skies that had once echoed with the shrill cry of the Zero were silent now. What remained of Japan's Air Force? Its airfields cratered, hangars burned, and flight schools empty had ceased to exist months earlier. Across the Pacific, thousands of Mustangs stood lined in rows, their canopies glinting in the island sun. These machines had done more than escort bombers. They had annihilated an entire aerial empire. The Zero, once feared and unmatched, now lay scattered across Asia. Broken fuselages in jungles, rusting engines in the surf, ghostly remnants of a vanished age. American ground crews found them everywhere. At abandoned airstrips in the Philippines, hidden under camouflage nets in Formosa, even half buried in coral on remote Pacific atolls, each discovery was a relic from an era that had ended not just in defeat, but in obsolescence. The Allies studied the wrecks carefully. Engineers measured, photographed, and disassembled what remained of Japan's once mighty fighter. What they found confirmed what the war had already proven. The Zero's brilliance had been frozen in time. Its light construction and extreme maneuverability had made it untouchable in 1941. But by 1944, those same qualities had turned into liabilities. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, no development margin. The Mustang's rise had been the opposite story. Evolution built into metal. It began as a contract design, refined through necessity, perfected by cooperation. Its very existence was the result of adaptation. The American need for range, the British gift of the Merlin engine, and the shared urgency of a war that demanded innovation faster than ideology could resist it. Where the Zero's engineers had prioritized agility over survival, the Mustang's designers created balance, speed, altitude, and endurance working as one. This combination became the modern fighter's foundation. It wasn't about turns per second or roll rate anymore. It was about control of altitude, energy, and mission. In the immediate aftermath of the war, U.S. pilots who had fought the Zeros were among the first to walk through the wreckage of Japan's airfields. Many admitted a strange respect for what they saw. They built a beautiful machine, one said, but they couldn't change it. That's what killed them. The Japanese engineers who survived the war understood that truth with painful clarity. Jiro Horikoshi, the designer of the Zero, lived to see the ruins of his nation's aviation dreams. He later wrote that the war had forced him to chase perfection in the wrong direction. His aircraft had achieved everything it was meant to. Just not for long enough. The post-war Allied evaluations concluded that the P-51 Mustang represented the full maturity of piston engine combat design. It had range to escort bombers anywhere, speed to dominate any propeller aircraft, and altitude performance that rivaled early jets. The Zero, by contrast, was a masterpiece of 1939, fighting in a world that had already moved to 1945. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. In 1941, Japan's empire had expanded on the wings of the Zero. By 1945, it surrendered beneath the shadow of the Mustang. American test pilots flew captured Zeros after the war. They admired its precision controls, but quickly found its limitations. It feels alive, one reported, but fragile, like it knows it doesn't belong in this decade anymore. Meanwhile, the Mustang's legacy deepened. It remained in service for years after the war, fighting again in Korea, escorting bombers and strafing ground targets with the same lethal grace. The Zero never flew in combat again. Its era had ended completely. In that contrast, the endurance of one and the extinction of the other, lay the quiet, unspoken verdict of history. Adaptability outlives mastery. The last Zeros left in Japan were either melted down for scrap or displayed as museum pieces. The once proud emblem of imperial aviation now stood behind glass, its story told by former enemies. And yet, even in defeat, the aircraft retained an aura. Its lines were too pure, its engineering too audacious to be forgotten. The Mustang might have conquered it, but the Zero had inspired it. From that paradox came the seed of aviation's next revolution. In the years that followed Japan's surrender, the world rebuilt, but the war's machines did not vanish quietly. They became monuments in motion, shaping every design that came after them. The Mustang and the Zero stood as opposites in every way, not just in engineering, but in philosophy. The Zero was born from isolation, from a nation that prized purity of concept above all else. The Mustang was born from cooperation, a transatlantic blend of necessity and invention. Together, they became case studies in how nations think, build, and learn under pressure. Post-war analysts in both America and Britain documented the lessons with clinical precision. They noted how Japan's fixation on agility had blinded it to the war's industrial reality. By prioritizing perfection in performance over survivability and scalability, the Zero had cornered itself. It could not be armored without losing its advantage. It could not be upgraded without collapsing under its own lightweight frame. It was a masterpiece that had nowhere to grow. The Mustang, on the other hand, had been designed with change in mind. Every version, from the Allison-powered P-51A to the Merlin-equipped D, evolved without breaking its essence. The airframe had room for adaptation, for endurance, for progress. That single difference, design flexibility, decided the fate of empires. Japan had entered the war with the most advanced fighter on Earth and left it with an air force grounded in ashes. The United States, which began the war without a single long-range escort capable of reaching its bombers, ended it by flying over Tokyo unchallenged. By 1946, captured Zeros were displayed in Allied hangars as technological curiosities. Engineers examined them not with fear, but with admiration. Admiration mixed with relief that such brilliance had limits. It was a perfect answer, one U.S. analyst wrote, to a question that no longer mattered. Back in Japan, the survivors of the once glorious Air Corps faced a different kind of battle. One of reflection. Many former Zero pilots, stripped of uniform and rank, turned to civilian life with a quiet dignity. A few became test pilots in the post-war era, contributing to Japan's re-emergence as a peaceful technological nation. Their knowledge helped shape the foundations of modern Japanese aviation. Horikoshi himself returned to engineering in the 1950s. He never built another warplane, but he remained a legend in Japanese design circles, a man who had touched the edge of perfection and paid the price for it. His memoir, Eagles of Mitsubishi, carried a quiet confession between the lines, that beauty, when placed above adaptability, leads only to extinction. Meanwhile, the P-51 Mustang lived on. In Korea, it strafed communist convoys and guarded jet bombers. In Europe, it became a trainer, a racer, and a Cold War guardian. Even decades later, private collectors restored and flew it, not as a relic, but as a living symbol of mechanical transcendence. The Zero did not share that fate. Its aluminum was too scarce, its airframes too few. The surviving examples were restored for museums, their engines sometimes replaced, just to keep them from decaying in silence. Each preserved Zero now stands as a ghost, a reminder of what happens when brilliance meets inevitability. The irony, of course, is that both aircraft pursued the same dream: freedom through flight, dominance through design. One achieved it through agility, the other through evolution. And in that struggle, the Japanese craftsman's precision versus the Allied engineer's adaptability, the future of aviation was decided. The jet age that followed took its cues not from the Zero, but from the Mustang. Range, speed, and balance became the foundation for the new world's air doctrines. Every jet fighter that came after, from the Sabre to the Phantom, carried that DNA forward. And yet, among pilots, a strange reverence persisted for the Zero. Not as a weapon, but as a memory of a time when flight itself was still art. On quiet airfields today, restored Mustangs still roar into the sky during commemorations. Their engines echo across fields once scarred by war. Somewhere a handful of surviving Zeros still fly, fragile, trembling, but alive. When they pass each other in the air, history breathes again. Two ghosts of an era that defined what human hands could build and what human pride could destroy. The Mustang's triumph was not only mechanical, it was philosophical. It proved that progress demands surrender of ego, of purity, of perfection, and in that surrender, it redefined what victory meant. The war ended 80 years ago, yet the echo of that rivalry still hums in every modern engine. The Zero and the Mustang, two machines that never should have met, became eternal opposites in the story of human creation. One chased beauty, the other chased evolution. The Zero embodied a nation's pride, light, graceful, flawless in motion. It was the art of flight distilled into metal. But art cannot survive the weight of industry. Its perfection was finite, locked inside the moment of its birth. When the war grew larger than skill, when production lines became battlefields, the Zero's design philosophy collapsed under the very ideal it served. The Mustang, in contrast, was never perfect. It was born from problem-solving, reworked again and again until function became elegance by accident. It proved that victory doesn't belong to what begins perfect, but to what keeps improving, what adapts, learns, and endures. Their duel was more than mechanical. It was civilizational. Japan's precision met America's pragmatism, and the result decided not just the war in the air, but the future of innovation itself. The Zero taught the world what mastery looked like. The Mustang taught it what survival required. Today, both aircraft exist only in museums and memory. Yet every modern fighter, every jet that streaks across the stratosphere, carries a fragment of that lesson. Behind the roar of turbines lies the same equation that defined 1945. Speed versus control, purity versus progress. For the pilots who lived it, the memory was never abstract. It was the smell of fuel, the tremor of wings at the edge of stall, the horizon flashing with tracer fire. They knew what the textbooks would later call design philosophy. They called it life or death. When a restored Mustang flies over an airshow crowd today, its shadow crosses generations that never knew war. The sound it carries is not victory, it's evolution, the reminder that perfection ends where progress begins. The Zero taught humility to its makers. The Mustang taught possibility to the world, and the sky, indifferent and endless, keeps both stories, unjudging, unchanging, eternal.